There is a coat that hangs on a hook by the door of a cottage that no longer has anyone living in it. It is heavy wool, worn at the elbows, the kind of coat that has been washed so many times it has forgotten its original colour, and settled into something between grey and brown that has no precise name. If you were to press your face into it, which a woman does every morning before she goes into the garden, you would find that it still holds something. Not a smell, exactly. Something older than smell. The memory of warmth. The memory of a man who understood that the first thing a cold and frightened person needs is not a diagnosis. This is the story of that coat, and the man who gave it away, and what giving it away cost him, and why he considered the cost entirely acceptable. The kingdom had a name for Grace Beaumont before she had a name for herself. At 20, she was the kind of beauty that stopped conversations. Not in the dramatic way of stories, not the room going silent when she entered, though that happened too, but in the quieter way of people losing their thread mid-sentence, their eyes finding her without permission, their minds briefly abandoning whatever they had been attending to. She had her father's bone structure and her mother's colouring, and a quality that neither parent had given her. Something in the way she occupied a room, not performing, just present, so fully present, that the room reorganised itself around her arrival. Duke Alistair noticed it in her when she was 7, and said to his wife Genevieve that their daughter was going to be one of those people the world decided to use, and that their job was to ensure she understood herself well enough to survive being used. Genevieve told him he was catastrophizing. He said he was parenting. They were both right. Grace grew up in a household of unusual warmth for its station. The estate was grand, but not cold. Alistair and Genevieve had married for love in an era when this was considered either romantic or irresponsible, depending on who you asked. And they had imported love into every room of the house and every arrangement of their family in a way that their social peers found both admirable and faintly unsettling. Grace was read to, argued with, and listened to. Her opinions were solicited at the dinner table and treated as worth examining rather than indulging. She was taught that her worth was not a function of her beauty or her bloodline, though her mother told her privately that the beauty would make people decide to pay attention before the worth had a chance to demonstrate itself, and that this was simply the landscape, and she should learn to navigate it rather than resent it. She was happy. Not in the performed way of people who have decided to be happy, but in the foundational way, happy in her structure, in the material of what she was made from. Then the illness arrived. It arrived the way the most destructive things arrive, not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, with the patience of something that has infinite time. A morning in April when she woke feeling not herself, which meant nothing. Everyone woke feeling not themselves sometimes. A week later, another morning like it. Then a pattern emerged from the individual instances, a tiredness that sleep did not resolve, a pallor that cosmetics could address but not cure, a weight in her limbs by afternoon that had not been there the year before. The physicians of the kingdom applied their vocabulary to it and found their vocabulary insufficient. They could describe the symptoms with precision. They could not name the cause. The nameless wilt, one of the less imaginative ones called it, meaning an absence of specific diagnosis, meaning we cannot find what is wrong and therefore cannot say what to call it, which in medical practice is a sentence that sounds like information, but is actually a very polished form of nothing. Alistair and Genevieve began to spend money. They spent it on physicians from the capital, and then physicians from the continent. And then physicians whose reputations had been constructed from whispers and rumours, in the way that desperate people construct hope from whatever materials are available. They spent it on remedies and protocols and retreats, and a year in a southern climate that was supposed to benefit the lungs and did not. They spent it with the focused urgency of two people who have one child and who love her in the foundational way she has learned to love herself, and who are watching something they cannot stop and cannot name. Grace watched them spend it and felt a guilt that she had no language for at 20. The illness was happening to her, but the suffering was distributed. Her mother's eyes in the morning, checking and then trying not to be seen checking. Her father's conversations with physicians behind closed doors. The low, urgent registers of men attempting to solve a problem that did not want to be solved. She became very good at performing health. Not for the social world, which she cared about considerably less than it would have liked, but for her parents. She learned the exact amount of colour in her cheeks that reassured her mother. She learned which hours of the day she had the most energy and scheduled her parents' most significant time with her in those hours. She performed well-being with the same precision that other people performed beauty or intelligence, because she understood that her parents' suffering was made worse by hers, and that the one gift she could give them was the performance of improvement. The social world was less kind. The kingdom's aristocratic network is a system of information exchange dressed as socializing, and the information it exchanged regarding Grace Beaumont in her early and mid-20s was the information of decline. The invitations continued for a while, out of politeness and morbid curiosity in roughly equal measure, and then they continued less. And then they arrived with the specific quality of invitations that are sent out of obligation rather than desire. And Grace, who had learned to read the distance between what was said and what was meant, understood the difference and stopped accepting. She was 25 when Lord Percival proposed. He came from a good family and had adequate looks and sufficient charm to perform adequately convincingly, and he had proposed to Grace in the full understanding of her condition because, he told himself and told her, he was not the kind of man who allowed a thing like illness to determine the worth of a person. He said this with the sincerity of a man who meant it at the moment of saying it, which is the most common and most destructive form of insincerity. Grace accepted. She accepted with the internal awareness of someone who understands that a person who has been narrowed by illness and abandonment has a different relationship to the available options than a person operating at full breadth. She accepted because Percival was kind enough and present, which, after years of progressive social withdrawal, felt like more than it was. She accepted because her parents' joy at the engagement was so genuine and so large that it filled the rooms of the estate for the first time in years, and she would not have taken that from them for anything. The wedding was set for October. The cathedral was arranged. The dress was made of ivory silk with small seed pearls at the collar. The dressmaker, working from measurements, taken on a morning when Grace's hands were steady enough to lift her arms for the process, without the trembling being notable. She stood at the back of the cathedral in the dress with her father beside her, and her father's arm under her hand was the warmest thing in the room, and she had never loved him more specifically than in that moment, his face arranged in the proud, careful expression of a father who was going to give his daughter to another person and was performing the gift correctly, despite the fact that giving her away was one of the hardest things he had ever done. They waited. The cathedral held its breath with them. Lord Percival did not come. Not late. Not delayed. Not present in any form. The message arrived at the cathedral via a courier who had been chosen for his speed rather than his discretion. And the message said, in careful, lawyerly language, that Lord Percival had concluded, upon reflection, that the arrangement was not one he was positioned to honour, and he wished the Duchess every possible happiness. Grace stood in the ivory dress and read the message. Her father's arm tightened under her hand with a force that she felt in her teeth. The cathedral was full of people because Alistair and Genevieve had invited everyone, and everyone had come because the wedding of a duke's daughter is a significant social event. And those people were now doing what people do in significant social events that have gone catastrophically sideways. They were very quiet. They were looking at her. They were composing the sentences they would use to describe this moment to the people who had not attended. Grace handed the message back to the courier. She thanked him for the delivery. She turned to her father and said she would like to go home. She said it with the precision and the control of a woman who has spent 5 years learning to perform stability on uncertain physical ground and has thereby acquired, as a side effect, the ability to perform stability on uncertain emotional ground as well. She was aware of the eyes on her. She gave them nothing. She walked out of the cathedral on her father's arm in the ivory dress, and she did not look at any of them. The whispers began before she reached the carriage. Who would marry a dying rose? She heard it, or something that amounted to it, in the particular frequency of crowd murmuring that carries specific sentences above the general noise. She did not react. She got into the carriage. She held her father's hand in the carriage for the entire ride home, and neither of them spoke. Her parents declined after that. She would resist the word blame. She would resist it her entire life. Her parents did not blame themselves precisely, but they carried something after the cathedral that she had not seen in them before, a tiredness that was not physical, the tiredness of two people who have spent years at maximum effort and have absorbed a blow that the maximum effort did not prevent. They loved her as completely as they ever had. But the love was being maintained now by people who were running on reserves. Her father died on a Thursday in late spring, in his chair by the study window, with his book open in his lap, so quietly that the household did not know until Martha went to call him for supper. Her mother died 11 weeks later. The physician said cardiac failure. Martha, who had been in the household for 20 years, said privately to Grace that it was nothing so specific, that Genevieve had simply decided, in the absence of Alistair, that the remaining distance was longer than she was willing to travel. Grace stood at both funerals in black and received the condolences of people who had been in the cathedral in October and thought about the difference between the two events and what that difference revealed about the people expressing sympathy. She was precise and correct and gracious, and she thanked everyone. She came home to the estate, which was very large and very quiet and entirely hers, and she sat in her father's chair by the study window, and she understood that the thing she had been surrounded by her entire life, the thing she had been operating inside of, the warm structure of her parents' love and its specific quality of being entirely unconditional, was gone. It had not diminished. It had not grown complicated. It was simply gone, because the people who had made it were gone, and nothing in the world was going to reconstitute it. She sat in the chair for a long time. Then she became practical, because practicality was the most available coping mechanism, and she had been practicing it for years. The estate was in order. Her parents had managed it well, and the money, though reduced from the years of physician spending, was sufficient and would remain so with careful management. She had Martha, who was not just staff, but the closest thing to a constant that remained. She had the library, which was large. She had the garden, which her mother had loved, and which Grace had learned to love in the years of her mother's grief, as a form of tending to her mother through the thing her mother cared for. She was 30 years old, and she had been managed by illness, abandoned by a suitor, and outlived her entire immediate family, and she was still, by the standards of the world she inhabited, wealthy and housed and cared for, which meant she had no socially sanctioned vocabulary for the scale of what she was carrying. She cancelled all medical appointments on a Tuesday morning, writing the letters herself in her clear, precise hand, thanking the attending physicians for their efforts and informing them that she would no longer require their services. Martha read the letters before they were sent and asked Grace directly what she was deciding. Grace told her the truth, that she had spent 10 years being a patient, and she intended to spend the time remaining being a person instead, and that the difference between the two was, she had concluded, a better investment than any further medical intervention. Martha did not agree. Martha said so. Grace heard her and did not change the letters. She was done. Not suicidal, she was precise about this in her own mind. She was not accelerating toward anything. She was simply stopping the effort of prolonged resistance to something that had not responded to 10 years of resistance, and deciding to occupy whatever time was available to her with something that felt like living rather than fighting. She sealed the letters and sent them. She went into the garden and sat in her mother's chair and turned her face toward the sun. October was wet that year, in the particular way of late autumns that seemed determined to make a point. Grace had developed, in the years since her parents' deaths, the habit of walking the estate's outer properties on days when the energy was available. It was partly practical, because an estate requires physical familiarity from its owner, and she had always managed her own affairs, and partly something harder to articulate, the feeling of being present in something large, of having the boundaries of herself interrupted by the scale of the world outside her own head. The southeastern corner of the estate was the most neglected, a section of mixed woodland and open ground that her father had maintained as shooting land, and that had grown gradually wilder in the years since. There was a road through it that connected, distantly, to the town, and the road had a cottage beside it, a modest structure, stone and timber, that she knew was on the estate's ledger as a tenant property, but whose current tenancy she had not, she realized as she walked the road that October afternoon, checked in longer than she should have. She was studying the question of the cottage's condition, at a practical level, when the weather changed. It changed the way late autumn weather changes when it has been accumulating all day, and has finally reached its conclusion, all at once, from grey to black, and then from black to water. A violent, soaking rain of the kind that renders visibility approximately 2 meters, and renders everything beyond those 2 meters irrelevant. Grace had no coat. She had walked out in the grey of the morning without adequate preparation, because she had been practical about the day's agenda and impractical about the day's weather, which was not a mistake she made often, and which she was now paying for comprehensively. She ran. Running was an activity that her body permitted in short bursts at the cost of what followed, and what followed was usually a significant debt of exhaustion. But the debt was a tomorrow problem, and the rain was a now problem, and the cottage was the nearest structure. And she ran. The porch was a narrow wooden overhang at the front, barely wider than her shoulders, and she pressed herself against the door under it and caught her breath in the shallow, difficult way that exertion imposed on her, the rain coming down 2 feet in front of her face in a solid curtain. She was soaked entirely. Her dress was a dark, clinging weight. Her hair had released itself from its arrangement and was plastered to her neck and face. She was shivering with the specific intensity of a body that is already compromised and has now added cold and wet to its existing management requirements. She raised her hand to knock. Her legs chose that moment to revise their earlier commitment to holding her upright. She was on the boards of the porch when the door opened, and Henry Thorne looked out and found her there. He was in his early 30s, with the kind of face that had been lived in, not aged, lived in, So the face of someone who spent time outside and thought a lot, and had not arranged themselves for observation. He was in shirt sleeves, the coat missing, and he looked at the woman on his porch with the immediate assessment of a man who has looked at a great many people in distress and learned to quickly identify what kind of distress. He crouched beside her. He said, "Is she all right?" Which was clearly not the case. But what was her breathing like? Which was the actually relevant question. Grace told him her breathing was its usual self, which was a more complicated answer than it sounded. He looked at her for one more second with that assessing look. Then he stood and went inside and came back in seconds with the coat, heavy grey-brown wool, and he put it around her shoulders with the efficient practicality of someone performing a clear and necessary action. And the warmth of it hit Grace's cold body with an immediacy that was almost painful. He helped her to the chair on the porch, a wooden thing with a cushion that had seen better weather, and went inside again. He came back with a blanket, and then with tea, strong and too hot, the kind of tea made by someone who knows that the temperature is part of the function. He sat in the other chair and waited. Grace drank the tea with both hands wrapped around the cup and did not speak for a while. The rain was very loud on the porch roof. The coat was heavy and warm and smelled like something she couldn't name, clean and a little like cedar, and she thought with the precise part of her brain that she was sitting on the porch of a stranger's cottage, wearing a stranger's coat in a rainstorm. And there was, she registered, something that felt very much like relief about that. She was nobody here. There was no Duchess. There was no illness. Not in the way there was always illness in her own house, where every room knew about it and every interaction had it as a background frequency. There was just rain and tea, and a stranger who had put his coat around her without asking her name. Henry asked, eventually, if she was passing through the area or local. She said the estate to the west was hers. He did not change. His expression did not rearrange itself into the social configuration that the word estate and the implicit title beneath it usually produced in people. He said that was a long walk in the bad weather. She said she had underestimated the afternoon. He said most people did. He said the afternoon looked like the morning when it started, and then made its own decisions. Grace looked at him over the teacup. He was looking at the rain. He had a profile that was interesting without being constructed for interest, the profile of a person who was thinking about something specific and was not performing their thinking. She asked what he did. He said he was a physician. Something shifted very slightly in her body that she immediately managed. She said that must be interesting work. He said it was. He said it was the most interesting work he'd found, and also the most insufficient, by which he meant that medicine had a very large gap between what it currently knew and what a sick person actually needed. And he found the gap more interesting than the knowledge, which was, he acknowledged, probably an unusual orientation. Grace said it didn't sound unusual to her. He looked at her then, for the first time in the conversation, directly. She looked back. Neither of them looked away for a moment. He asked if she wanted more tea. She said yes. She stayed on the porch for 2 hours. They talked about things she had not talked about with anyone since her parents. Not about illness. She deflected that from the one moment he moved toward it with the expertise of someone who has been deflecting for years. But about other things. About the difference between living in a place and existing in it. About what people meant when they said they were fine. About her mother's garden and the particular logic of what her mother had planted and where, which she had only recently begun to understand. About loss in the broad sense, the kind that doesn't have a single event attached to it, but accumulates instead. The specific weight of 10 years of incremental removal. Henry listened the way he had looked at the rain, with complete attention, not the performing kind, not the kind that waits for gaps to respond in, but the kind that is genuinely occupied by what it's receiving. He talked too. Not about himself in the large sense. She would learn later that he was not a man who disclosed the large things quickly, but about small observations. About the cottage's garden, which he was attempting to bring back from significant neglect. About the particular quality of the light in the eastern field at morning, which he had started walking to see. About a patient in the town, described without name or identifying detail, an old man who refused to discuss his symptoms but had taught Henry 3 regional card games as a form of conversational currency, and how Henry had become quite good at the games while continuing to observe the symptoms from the neighbouring side of the transaction. Grace laughed at the card game story. A real laugh, the kind that didn't require managing, and then she was briefly aware of the laugh, and then she let the awareness go and let the laugh just be itself. When the rain stopped, the silence it left was large and pleasant. She became aware of the time and of the coat around her shoulders, and of the fact that she had been on a stranger's porch for 2 hours, and Martha would have begun her particular calibrated form of worrying. She stood carefully, and the standing was all right. She began to remove the coat. He said to keep it. He said the evening was still cold, and the walk was significant. She said she would return it. He said no particular hurry. She walked back through the wet woodland in the heavy coat with the smell of cedar and something unnamed around her, and the feeling, strange and specific, that the afternoon had given her something she did not have a word for. Not happiness, exactly. Something more fundamental. The feeling of being present in her own time. The feeling of occupying an hour rather than surviving it. She was at the gate of the main estate before she identified it precisely. She had, for 2 hours on a stranger's porch in the rain, entirely forgotten that she was sick. She came back the following evening. She told herself it was to return the coat, which she had carefully dried and folded, and which she carried under her arm as evidence of the practical nature of the visit. She arrived at the cottage in the late afternoon, and Henry answered the door and looked at the coat under her arm and said he had meant no particular hurry. She said she was in the neighbourhood. He said the neighbourhood was, practically speaking, her entire property. She said yes, and. He held the door open and she came in. The cottage's interior was modest and very full. Books everywhere, on shelves and stacked on surfaces, and in 2 cases directly on the floor in organised piles that suggested they had outgrown the shelves and been placed with intention rather than neglect. A work table with papers and instruments. A fireplace with 2 chairs that were positioned toward it, with the slight unevenness of chairs that have been moved frequently for individual preference, rather than placed once and left. She sat in the left one. He made tea again. She noted that the coat was back on the hook by the door rather than put away, which she catalogued and did not comment on. They talked for 3 hours. It became, without discussion or announcement, a daily arrangement. Grace had a talent for managing information, which she had developed over years of managing what people knew about her condition and what they did not, and she managed the information of these visits with precision. She came in the late afternoon, after the hours when the household was most occupied with its various responsibilities and before the evening meal that structured the end of the day. She used the woodland path rather than the main road, which was nobody's habit and therefore nobody's observation. She told Martha, who was the one person whose attention was impossible to entirely avoid, that she was walking the southeastern property regularly, which was true, and declined to expand on it, which Martha accepted in the way Martha accepted most of Grace's decisions, with visible disapproval and total loyalty. Henry did not know she was a duchess for 6 weeks. He knew she was from the estate, and he understood from context that she was the estate's owner rather than staff. But the specific title had not been exchanged in the first conversation and had not been supplied in subsequent ones. And Henry was a man who did not require people to provide their full accounting immediately, who allowed people to give what they were ready to give, which was, though Grace did not know it yet, a professional habit that had become a personal one. She found, in those 6 weeks, what it felt like to exist outside of her own history. He did not know about Lord Percival. He did not know about the cathedral and the whispers and the years of performed stability. He did not know about Alistair and Genevieve, except what she chose to tell him, and what she chose to tell him she could frame without the weight of his prior knowledge, not omitting, just selecting, her giving him the truth without the archive of context that every other person who knew her carried around their understanding of her. She told him about the garden and what her mother had meant by it. She told him about her father's arguments at dinner, the way he would take the counter position, not because he held it, but because he wanted to see her hold her own ground, and how she had not understood, until she was much older, that it was a form of love. She told him about the books she was reading and the arguments she had with them. In return, he gave her pieces of himself that assembled slowly into something she was aware of being given. He was not a man who had arrived at his work through simple vocation. There was something driving him that was more than an interest in the gap between medicine and what people needed. She could feel something without seeing its shape yet, the way you can feel the weather coming without seeing the clouds. She was not trying to get into the gap. She was not asking questions in the spaces where he went quiet. She was letting him arrive at what he was ready to arrive at. It was, she thought, the most honest form of conversation she had ever had. 2 people not performing for each other, just being present and letting what was true surface on its own schedule. He told her about Clara on a Wednesday in November. He told her without preamble and without the narrative distance of something that has been processed. He said he had been married. He said his wife's name was Clara, and that she had been 28, and that she had died of a nameless illness that the medicine of the time had been unable to address. He said it simply, but the simplicity was the simplicity of enormous compression, years of grief folded into the fewest possible sentences, and Grace heard the compression without needing it to expand. She said she was sorry. He said it was 3 years ago. He said it in the way people say something is 3 years ago, when what they mean is that 3 years has not accomplished what 3 years theoretically should. She said 3 years is not very long. He looked at the fire. He said no, it wasn't. She said his wife's name was beautiful. He said Clara had found it old-fashioned. He said she had campaigned, during their entire 4 years of marriage, for him to call her something else, and he had refused on the grounds that her name was her name, and she had maintained the campaign anyway as a form of marital sport, and he missed the campaign as much as anything, which was a strange thing to miss, but was what it was. Grace sat with that for a moment, the specific shape of what he was describing, grief not as the absence of a person, but as the absence of the texture of life with that person. All the small particular things that had no grand significance, but whose collective removal left a hole the size of everything. She knew that hole. She had been living next to it for 3 years ago. It simply had different furniture in it. They sat by the fire for a long time that evening without saying much, and the silence was not the silence of nothing to say, but of too much said, and the right to sit quietly inside it. She went home in the dark, with the woodland path guiding her, and she thought about Clara, a woman she would never meet, who had loved a man who went to sit by the fire in the evenings and whose absence had built the gravity that had drawn Grace Beaumont to a porch in a rainstorm in October and held her there. Martha told her about the saint of the poor 3 days later. Martha had a network of household and town information that operated below the official level of news and considerably above it in accuracy, and what the network had delivered regarding the physician who had taken the cottage on the Beaumont southeastern property was extensive and consistent. Henry Thorne, 33, trained on the continent, had served in a military capacity in the eastern conflicts before turning to civilian medicine, had a reputation in the towns where he had previously worked that bordered on the legendary in the specific way that legends form around people who do something reliably and at high personal cost. He treated everyone. He turned no one away for lack of funds. He had been known to sit with patients through nights that required sitting through. He was known, in the medical community, for heterodox methods and a willingness to investigate approaches that the establishment found questionable, which the establishment did not appreciate, and which his patients found effective. He had lost his wife 3 years prior to a nameless illness. He had left the city shortly after and begun moving, working in one place until he felt there was no more he could do there, and then moving to the next. He had arrived in the southeastern cottage 6 weeks ago. Martha told Grace all of this in the morning room over tea, with the careful presentation of a woman who knows she is delivering information that will be received in a complicated way, and who has decided the recipient needs it regardless. Grace listened. She asked 2 clarifying questions. She finished her tea. She sat for the rest of the morning in her father's chair by the study window and thought about 6 weeks of conversations on a cottage porch and by a fire, and thought about the man she had been talking to, and then she thought about what happened when a physician realized he was talking to a patient. She knew what had happened. She had watched it happen many times. The face changed. The quality of attention changed. The listening, which had been the listening of a person hearing another person, became the listening of a professional receiving clinical data. The warmth did not necessarily leave, but it reorganized itself around a function. She became, in a physician's presence, a case. She did not want to be Henry's case. She went to the cottage the following afternoon and sat in her chair and talked about the garden and about a book she had been reading and about the card game patient, who had apparently developed a philosophical position on the existence of luck that Henry found worth examining. She talked about everything except the thing she knew and he did not, which was that she was sick in a way he would recognize. She did this for 3 more visits. On the 4th visit, she did not arrive. She told herself it was the weather, which was bad. Then she told herself it was the fatigue, which was real. Then she told herself the truth, which was that she was afraid of the specific thing that would happen when he found out. And the truth was easier to manage from a distance than from the chair by his fire. She stayed away for a week. The week was one of the longer ones of recent memory, not because anything in particular happened, but because the absence of the afternoon visits was a specific and shaped absence, not the general absence of people and warmth she had been living in for 3 years. But the absence of this particular thing that she had apparently built a dependency on without entirely noticing. She went back on a Wednesday. She did not have a prepared reason and did not supply one. She knocked, and Henry opened the door and looked at her and said he was glad. Not an interrogation of the absence. Just, "I am glad you are here." She sat in her chair. The fire was already built. She understood, sitting there, that he had been building the fire every afternoon regardless. She was in the garden near the cottage a week after her return, in the late afternoon, gathering the specific herbs she grew for a tincture that one of her parents' old physicians had suggested, and that she continued making from habit more than conviction, when she became aware that she was not going to be able to get back to the main estate without stopping. The episode came with a warning, which she was accustomed to navigating, and she navigated toward the cottage because it was the nearest structure, and she was pragmatic about these things. She made it to the garden's low wall and sat on it, and was employing the breathing technique that managed these moments, when she heard the cottage door open. Henry came out without his coat, which meant he had come quickly, which meant he had been watching through the window, which meant he had been paying attention at a level she had not quite accounted for. He sat on the wall beside her. He did not take her pulse. He did not produce a medical instrument or a notebook. He sat beside her and said nothing for a moment, and then he said her breathing was being managed well. Not a question. An observation. The observation of someone who has seen this breathing pattern in his professional life and is filing what he is seeing with the precision of someone who has been filing it for some time. She said he had known. He said he had seen signs for several weeks. She said why hadn't he said anything? He said he had learned that the person had to be ready to talk about it, that arriving at it from outside never worked, that the information had to come from the person who was carrying it. She looked at him. He was looking at the garden with a profile that thought about specific things. She looked at the garden too. She told him. Not the history of physicians and failed cures, not the decade of management and decline, but the fundamental truth of what she was carrying and the decision she had made 6 weeks before coming to the porch in the rain. The decision to stop fighting and start living. She told it simply, the way he had told her about Clara, with the compression of years in the fewest possible words. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, the garden was quiet. He said he knew this illness. The quality of his voice changed in a way she had not heard before. Not the professional configuration she had been afraid of. Something older than that. Something that came from further inside him. He said his wife had this illness. He did not say he had been unable to save her. He did not need to say it. She could hear it in the space where the rest of the sentence would have been. He looked at her then. Not the physician's assessment, not the careful profiling she had been monitoring for weeks. Something different. He looked at her with an expression that she would describe later, to herself, in the privacy of her own mind, as a man looking at the thing he has been moving toward for 3 years without knowing what it was going to look like when he arrived. He said, I did not have the skill then. He said, I have it now. He said, I will not lose you. It was not a proposal. It was a statement of intent made by someone who did not say things he did not mean. And Grace heard it as such, and felt something shift in her chest that was not the illness. She said he had not even asked her name. He said he had been thinking of her as Grace. She asked how. He said one of her herb bundles in the garden had her name on the parchment. He said he had tried very hard not to know, and had known anyway. She said her full name was Lady Grace Beaumont, Duchess of the Beaumont estate. He said he was aware. He said it without any of the reconfiguration she had been afraid of. She looked at him. He looked at her. The garden was very quiet. He asked her to marry him on a Thursday morning in December, 6 weeks later, in the cottage garden with the frost still on the ground, and the proposal was nothing like the cathedral. It was 2 chairs pulled close together, and tea going cold between them, and the most direct and least theatrical conversation Grace had ever had about the rest of her life. He said he knew the proposal was unconventional. He said he was proposing not out of pity, which he said with the direct certainty of a man who knew the difference, and knew she would need to hear it stated, but because he needed to be beside her completely to have any chance of finding what he was looking for. And beside her completely in the way that the law and society understood meant marriage, which meant they needed to be married, and which meant he was asking. He said he had been looking for the answer to the question that Clara's death had asked him for 3 years. He said he believed the answer was available, but that finding it would require time, access, and proximity that current social arrangements did not permit. He said he was also, separate from the medical argument, entirely clear that she was the most real person he had met in 3 years, and that he would like to spend the available time in proximity to that, regardless of outcome. Grace sat with both hands around her cold tea. She had stood in a cathedral in ivory silk and waited for a man who had not come. She was sitting in a frost-covered garden in her heaviest coat, being proposed to by a man who had been building fires every afternoon on the probability of her return. She said yes. The ceremony was in the cottage. Martha was present, and Henry's one close associate in the town, the old physician who had been there long enough to have witnessed most things and who treated the occasion with the respectful brevity it requested. There were no flowers, except the ones from Grace's mother's garden that she had gathered herself that morning. There was no dress, except the good blue wool she considered her best. There were vows said in the voice of 2 people who had arrived at a decision through the long, honest route and were at peace with having taken it. Martha cried, which she would have denied under questioning. Grace and Henry walked back to the main estate afterward in the winter light, and Henry looked at the estate with the expression of someone encountering the practical scale of something for the first time. And Grace told him that she had more rooms than she had uses for, and that he should treat it as entirely his, and that his work table and his books would be accommodated. His work table and his books took up 3 rooms. He built a study and a laboratory in the east wing, with the systematic focus of a man who has been waiting to have the space for this work. And Grace, who had the habit of walking the estate in its quiet hours, passed the east wing door, frequently in the early mornings and late evenings, and noted that the light was almost always on. She did not ask the specifics of what he was working on. She knew he was working on her, or rather on the problem she represented. But she knew also that the working required a kind of solitary focus that her presence would interrupt, and that he would tell her what was relevant when there was something relevant to tell. What he told her was partial truths, carefully constructed. He told her he was pursuing a line of botanical investigation that showed promise, that there were compounds in certain plants that the mainstream pharmacological tradition had not adequately explored, that he was cautiously optimistic about a specific preparation he was developing. He gave her these updates at dinner in the even tones of a man reporting progress, and Grace, who could read the distance between what was said and what was meant better than almost anyone she knew, read the distance and did not push at it. She was aware that something was not quite adding up. She filed the awareness. The winter moved toward spring, and spring meant, practically, that Grace could be in her mother's garden again, which was one of the better things about her days. She had been maintaining it since Genevieve died, learning as she went, making mistakes and correcting them, and in the process, developing a relationship with the garden that was her own rather than an extension of her mother's, though her mother's intentions were still legible in every arrangement. Henry came to the garden sometimes and sat with her while she worked. He was not a gardener. He understood plants at the cellular level and was relatively incompetent at the physical management of them. And Grace found this gap between his professional competence and his practical helplessness in the garden genuinely endearing, in a way she did not express out loud, but that he could apparently read in her face, because he was frequently aware of being found endearing and responded to it with the slight defensiveness of a man not accustomed to being found anything in particular. She was in the garden in late March when the episode arrived with less warning than usual. She had learned to manage them, the pre-episode reading of her own body, but this one moved through the preliminary phase faster than she was accustomed to, and she was on the bench under the apple tree before she fully understood that it was worse than usual, breathing in the difficult managed way, and the managed way was not managing. Henry was there. She did not know how long before she was aware of him. He had arrived at some point between her sitting and her struggling, and he was kneeling in front of her with both her hands in his face at her level. His face was not the face of a physician. It was the face of a man watching something he had been afraid of, looking at it directly and making a decision. He said her name. She focused on his voice the way the technique required, a focal point, something outside the body to anchor the awareness to, and his voice was a very good anchor. She came back. She sat on the bench and breathed in the thin, careful way, and Henry stayed on his knees in front of her with her hands in his, and neither of them spoke for a while. She asked him how worried he was. He said he was working on something. She said she knew. She said she was asking him to tell her the truth about how much time the work needed. He looked at her for a long time, with the complicated honesty of a man who has more information than he wants to give, and less certainty than he wants to have. He said he was close. She said close was good. He said yes. She said Henry. He looked at her. She said she was not afraid of the ending. She said she had made her peace with it 3 years ago, and it was still made. She said what she did not want was for him to be driven into something desperate by the pace of things. He looked at her hands in his. He said he understood what she was saying. He did not say he agreed with it. She went to bed early that night, and Henry returned to the east wing, and the light under the study door was on until after midnight, which was not unusual, and then it was on until before dawn, which was. The ancient medical texts were not all in languages that cooperated. Henry had Latin and Greek and adequate French, and a functional reading knowledge of the old Arabic pharmaceutical tradition, and he had been working through materials that pushed all 4 of those competencies to their edges. The document he had found 3 months prior, in a private library belonging to an eccentric continental collector who owed Henry a favour from a complicated encounter in the military years, was a mixture of Latin and an older dialect that he had been working to pass with the help of a correspondence with a philologist in the university, conducted through letters that arrived slowly and were not always complete. The document described, in the careful, dense language of someone writing for an audience that understood the stakes, a process that the author called the transference. The theory was not, to Henry's medical mind, entirely beyond the rational. The body was a system of ongoing exchanges. Blood was the most obvious, but not the only medium through which the system communicated. The illness he had been studying, the one that had taken Clara and was taking Grace, operated at a level of the body's fundamental exchange mechanism that no pharmacological intervention addressed, because no pharmacological intervention could reach it. It was not in the blood, in the treatable sense. It was in the instruction system beneath the blood. The transference proposed that this instruction system, this underlying language of the body's maintenance, could be affected by a sufficiently proximate and sufficiently calibrated biological connection to another person's system. That the illness's instructions could be, not removed, but rerouted, transferred along the connection between 2 living systems to a body where they could be absorbed and neutralized, if the receiving body had the particular biological capacity to handle the absorption. The text was clear about the cost. Stark, actually, in the way of old medical writing that did not use softening language, because the tradition it was written in had no vocabulary for softening. The receiving body would absorb the transferred instructions, would integrate them, would, over time, express them. The pace depended on the individual's constitution. The outcome did not vary. Henry had read this section of the document 17 times. He had corresponded with the philologist about 3 specific phrases in the older dialect, wanting to be absolutely certain he was reading them correctly. He was reading them correctly. He had then spent 2 weeks on the mathematics of the thing, which the text did not provide, but which his medical training allowed him to construct from the parameters given, and the mathematics were consistent with the text. He had then spent another 2 weeks sitting with what he knew. He thought about Clara. He thought about the night she had died, the specific hour of it, the precise moment when the breathing had stopped, and the quality of that moment, and what he had understood in it, which was that there was nothing he could do, and that he had not had what was required to do, the one thing that might have changed it. He had not known about the transference when Clara was alive. He had found the document 8 months after she died in the private library, and had read it twice and set it aside for 6 months because the reading of it was a form of unbearable knowledge and he had not been ready to inhabit it. He was ready now. He was also in possession of something he had not been in possession of when he found the document. He had Grace. He had Grace. And Grace was going to die. And he had the document, and the mathematics were consistent. And the question was not whether the transference was possible. The question was what he was going to tell her about it. He made his decision on a Tuesday in April, in the East Wing at 3 in the morning, with the document open before him and the mathematics in his own hand covering the pages around it. He told her he had found a preparation. He described it as botanical in origin, which was partially true. The preparation itself used plant compounds as a delivery medium. He described the process as a series of administrations over several evenings, which was accurate. He described the expected outcome as a gradual improvement in the body's fundamental maintenance capacity, which was also accurate, from one direction. He did not describe the mechanism. He did not describe what the mechanism required of the person administering it. Grace listened to the description with the attention she gave to everything and asked 3 questions, all of which he answered truly within the parameters of what he was choosing to disclose. She asked if there were risks. He said every medical intervention carried some risk. She asked what the success probability was. He said the literature he was working from described a high rate of efficacy in cases presenting the relevant symptoms. She asked if he was confident. He looked at her and said yes, with the complete conviction of a man who is confident in the outcome and has made his peace with its terms. She said all right. He said he would begin the following evening. He began on a Wednesday. The process was quiet and required close proximity, and what he had constructed to facilitate it looked, to any observer, like a physician sitting beside a patient's bed in the evening, the kind of attendance that was associated with his practice anyway. He sat beside her for the relevant duration, which the text specified, and the preparation was applied at the relevant points, which the text specified, and the transference moved in the direction the text had predicted with the efficacy the text had described. He sat with her until she was asleep each evening and then returned to the East Wing and worked. The first indication that something was changing came in the 2nd week. Grace noticed it before she could name it. The way you notice the quality of air changing before you identify the direction of the wind. She woke one morning and lay in the early light running the usual internal accounting, the habitual check of how the body was reporting from the night's rest, and found that the report was different. Not dramatically, not conclusively, but the particular weight that had settled into her limbs in the mornings over the years was slightly less. The breath came slightly more easily. She lay still and breathed and did not trust it yet. because she had had better mornings that returned to worse ones, and she was too careful a person to invest in a single data point. The data has been accumulated. By the third week of the administration, she was getting up with the energy she had learned not to expect after noon. By the fourth week, she was in the garden in the morning, which was not where she had been able to be for 3 years in the morning, because the morning had always been the worst of the body's hours. She told Henry. She told him carefully, monitoring his face, watching for the physician's assessment, watching for what his expression would tell her about how confident he had actually been, versus how confident he had told her he was. His face showed something she had not expected. It showed relief, which was expected. But underneath the relief was something else, something she did not have a name for yet, something that had the quality of a man who has placed a very large bet and has watched it come in and is aware of what paying the bet required. She filed it. Spring became summer, and summer was the best that Grace could remember in a decade. She walked the estate in the mornings, the full perimeter, something she had not been able to do in years, and the mornings had a quality she had forgotten was available to them. She was in the garden when the light was right, and she stayed in it until the light changed, and she was not counting the cost in advance, not pre-managing the exhaustion, just being in the garden. She laughed more. She ate more. Martha watched all of this with an expression that was the happiest Grace had ever seen Martha's face achieve without abandoning its characteristic guardedness, and said nothing except that the kitchen should adjust its provisions accordingly, which was Martha's way of saying that her person was eating again, and this was a development she approved of. Henry watched her. He watched her in the garden, and in the mornings, and at dinner, and at every moment that was available to him, with an attention that she noticed and that she understood was not the physician's watching, not the monitoring of a case. It was the watching of a man who is looking at something he wants to look at for as long as looking is possible. She was in the East Wing one afternoon in August, delivering tea because Henry's habit of forgetting to eat or drink when he was in the laboratory had become one of the household's standing practical problems, and she set the tea on the cleared corner of the work table and looked at the open materials on the table and felt, before she understood what she was looking at, the particular sensation of pattern recognition arriving. She stood very still and looked at what was in front of her. The document in the old Latin and the older dialect, her own name in Henry's handwriting in the margins, the mathematics that she could not follow in detail but whose structure she recognized as the careful working of someone building a proof. The word transference, repeated in multiple places, the Latin root of it clear enough. She did not touch anything. She stood in the East Wing for a long time. Then she went to find Martha and asked her, in the direct and calm voice she used when she needed a direct and calm answer, what she had observed about Henry's physical condition over the last 2 months. Martha's face told her before Martha spoke. Martha said she had noted that Dr. Thorne had been wearing his gloves more frequently than the season required, that she had observed him adjusting his collar at the neck on several occasions, with a gesture that suggested the collar was covering something rather than simply adjusted for comfort, that his colouring was not what it had been in December, which she had attributed to indoor work, but had been, she acknowledged, not entirely persuaded by that attribution. Grace thanked her. She sat in her father's chair by the study window for the rest of the afternoon, and did not move. She found Henry's medical journals in the East Wing that evening, after dinner, after Henry had gone to bed early for the 3rd consecutive evening, which she had observed and attributed and was now reattributing. The journals were not hidden. She thought he had perhaps not hidden them because some part of him had already accepted that she would find them. that the finding was part of the truth he had been moving toward telling her. The journals were precise and clinical, and written in the voice of a physician, documenting a case with the professional distance that medical writing required. The case he was documenting was his own. She read everything. She sat with the journals in her lap until the lamp oil was low, and then she sat in the dark. He had known the outcome before he began. The mathematics were laid out in his own hand. The rate of absorption, the progression timeline, the prognosis are expressed in the flat language of someone who has accepted a calculation and is reporting it without editorial. He had known exactly what paying the transference required before the first evening, before she had said yes to the description he had given her, before he had sat beside her the first time with the preparation and the proximity. He had known, and he had done it anyway, and he had not told her. She thought about Clara. She thought about the coat on the hook by the door, the coat that belonged to Clara, that he had put around her shoulders on the porch in October, because the first thing a cold and frightened person needed was warmth and not a history. She thought about the fire built every afternoon during the week she had stayed away. She thought about 3 years of a man moving between towns with a grief that had no resolution, and a skill he had not had when he needed it, and a question he needed to answer, and the night he had made his decision in the East Wing at 3 a.m. She thought about the evening in the garden when she had told him she was not afraid of the ending, and asked him not to be driven into something desperate, and what he had said. He had said he understood what she was saying. He had not said he agreed with it. She went to him in the early morning, when the house was quiet and the light was the grey pre-dawn that had no colour yet, and she sat on the edge of the bed beside him and said his name. He woke and looked at her. She could see it in the morning light now that she was looking with the right understanding. The colour, the slight shadow beneath the eyes was not tiredness in the ordinary sense. His hands on the blanket, and the gloves not on them. The veins at the wrist with the discoloration she had not recognized for what it was because she had not been looking for it. She said she had read the journals. He lay still for a moment. He said he was sorry she had found them that way. She said she was not talking about the way she had found them. They sat in the pre-dawn light, and she felt the anger moving through her and let it move through without stopping it. The anger that was love's direct corollary. The anger of someone who has been protected from the full truth by the person they trusted to tell it to them. And she let it move through, and then she set it down, because it was less useful than what came after it. She said she was pregnant. Henry's face in the pre-dawn light moved through the same arithmetic that hers had moved through when she had understood it. Joy and its shadows arriving simultaneously. The knowledge of what it cost and what it gave arriving in the same second. He took her hand. She held it. She said his name, and he said hers, and the grey light outside the window was beginning its slow movement toward the colour of morning. He asked her to take him to the porch. He said it quietly, with the directness of a man who has been moving toward a thing for a long time, and has arrived at it and knows where he wants to be. They went in the October morning, the same October month that had begun everything a year prior, the morning cool and clear, the leaves turning, the smell of the woodland unchanged. She arranged the chairs the way they had been that first afternoon, and she wrapped the heavy wool coat around him, his own coat, Clara's coat, because the morning was cold, and she was someone who put coats around people who needed warmth. He looked at the trees and the light and the quality of the morning with the full attention he gave to everything. He said the coat he had given her that day had been Clara's. He said it in the way you say things that you have been waiting to say, with the relief of something finally arriving at its destination. He said he had been wearing it because he had not been ready to put it away, and he had given it to her because he had not been able to watch her shivering, and the coat was what was available. And he had not known then what either thing meant, and he had known later. Grace said she knew. She held his hand. He said he had failed Clara. She said no. He said quietly that he had not had what was required. He said he had spent 3 years being unable to answer the question that her death had asked him. He said he had the answer now. She said the answer had cost too much. He said it had cost exactly what it had cost. He said that was a different thing. He was quiet for a moment. The light moved through the woodland in the long shapes that the October morning made. The same light that had been in the attic in the story of another painter, another woman, another man who had decided to pay the full cost without announcement. He said, "I failed, Clara, but I saved you. That is my masterpiece." He said it with the complete peace of a man who has finished what he set out to finish and is content with the work. Grace held his hand, and the morning held them in it, and the light moved, and the trees were the colour they turned in October when the year began its final work. And Henry Thorne died in the chair on the porch of his cottage, with his face toward the trees and Grace Beaumont's hand in his, in the specific mourning peace of a man who had given away everything he had and was entirely comfortable with the accounting. Martha was in the garden. She heard nothing. There was nothing to hear. It was not that kind of ending. She looked toward the porch and understood, from the particular quality of stillness that had settled over the 2 chairs, what had happened. And she stood very still in the garden for a moment before she moved. 5 years have a particular quality when you occupy them alone with a child. They are full, and they are long, and they are exhausting in the specific way that love is exhausting when it is the only direction you are running in. And Grace ran in it with everything she had because she understood what it had cost to have the option. She named her daughter Clara. She told people it was in honor of an old family friend. And she told her daughter the truth, that the name had belonged first to a woman who had deserved better and who was owed something by the living, and that carrying the name was a form of payment. Little Clara was 5 years old and entirely herself, which was the thing about her that Grace loved most specifically, the complete unself-consciousness of being exactly what you were without editing. She had Henry's eyes, the same considering eyes that had looked at Grace across the fire and registered things that had not been said. And she had Grace's garden instinct, already knowing by feel which plants were healthy and which were struggling, already making decisions about the beds with the confidence of someone who had been doing this for years. She had not been doing it for years. She was 5. Grace found this capacity both remarkable and unsurprising. The cottage stood. Grace had maintained it. Not as a museum, she was too practical for that. The cottage was on her estate, and it was a structure in good repair, and she maintained it in good repair. But she had not changed the interior in any significant way, and the coat remained on its hook by the door, because she was the person who put coats around people who needed warmth, and she understood that this coat's being on the hook was not sentiment in the inert sense, but something active, a presence, a continuance. She went to it in the mornings sometimes, before Clara was awake, and stood in the cottage for a few minutes, in the quiet. She did not cry, usually. She had done her crying in the year after, which had been necessary and which she had done privately and thoroughly, and what she did now in the mornings was something different, more like attendance than grief, being present with something that was still real even in its absence. She went to the garden. Clara was already there. Grace was never sure how she was always already there, whether she woke earlier than Grace noticed, or simply manifested in the garden at morning with the same conviction she had about everything. She was on the path between the lavender beds, with her hands in the soil of a section she had decided, without consultation, to rearrange, looking up at her mother with the expression of someone who anticipates that their decision may require defending. Grace sat in her mother's chair. She had the coat over her arm, which she sometimes brought to the garden in the mornings, and she held it in her lap and felt its weight, which was considerable, which she was glad of. Clara came and sat at her feet, which was her particular way of occupying the same space as her mother, physically present, but with the independence maintained. She pulled at a thread on her dress hem, which meant she was thinking. She asked about the coat. She had asked before, at different ages, and received age-appropriate portions of the answer. She was 5 now, which Grace had decided was old enough for more. Grace looked at the coat in her lap. She thought about a porch in October, and rain, and the specific warmth of wool, and a voice asking the actually relevant question, and tea, too hot, and 2 hours of conversation in which she had forgotten, for the first time in years, that she was sick. She told Clara about the man who had given her the coat. She told her about the cottage, and the fire built every afternoon on the probability of her return, about the east wing and the lamp that was on until before dawn, about the mathematics worked out in a careful hand on the pages beside an ancient document, about a man who had understood the full cost before he agreed to it, and who had then paid it, as he paid everything, with complete attention and no complaint. She told her that the coat had belonged first to another woman, a woman who had deserved more time, whose name Clara carried, and that it had come to her by the route it had come to her, and that she carried it now because the carrying was a form of memory that was also a form of living, which was the only form of memory worth having. Clara listened with Henry's eyes. She reached up and touched the coat with the careful hands she used for the garden, the hands that knew how to be gentle with things that had been through a great deal. She said the man who gave the coat away sounds like he was very brave. Grace looked at her daughter in the garden, in the morning light that came over the estate wall and fell on the beds that her mother had planted, and that she had tended, and that Clara was already beginning to understand. She said yes. She said he was the bravest person she had ever known. Not brave in the way of people who do not understand the cost. Brave in the way of people who understand it exactly and agree to it anyway. She said there was a difference between those two things. Clara thought about this with the thoroughness she applied to things she found important. She said she understood. Grace believed her. She sat in the garden in the morning light with the coat in her lap and her daughter at her feet and the estate around them, which was large enough to get lost in, and which had been, for years, a place where she had been lost and had found herself found. And she breathed in the way of someone for whom breathing is not an abstraction, but a daily and particular gift. A gift given by someone who had understood its value more precisely than she ever had. She breathed and breathed and breathed. The morning continued. The garden continued. Little Clara continued, already back on her feet, already moving toward the lavender with some intention in mind that she had not yet shared. Grace watched her go. She held the coat and felt its weight, and stayed in the morning for as long as the morning would have her, which, on these days, was as long as she wanted. That was the gift, not a grand gesture, not the theatrical version. Just this morning, given back. Just the day, made available. Just the breath, ordinary and present and entirely hers. He had called it his masterpiece. He was not wrong.